All right, my English teacher friends. So in this writing workshop, I got some super pie in the sky kind of stuff for you. And it comes in the form of an edible template, an edible graphic organizer. And it's all contingent upon this. I was meditating the other night with my group. So every Tuesday night I get together with a group of people and we meditate and do yoga and just talk about our spiritual practices. And I kid you not, in the midst of my meditation, 3 times I heard repeated, kind of like in this mantra form, edible template, edible graphic organizer. 3 times it said it. And I'm like, holy cow, what the heck is going on with this? I just shrugged it off. And then I had this idea, this concept, and I've tried it out with a number of different students, a number of different districts, and it really works. So before you wince at it and say, oh, this is like way out there, this is like super unorthodox stuff, it really works. And some of my reluctant, struggling, emerging writers, this particular edible template that I'm going to show you right now, their light bulbs illuminated after I showed them how to do this. So it all is contingent upon the old Lay's potato chip commercials and their adage of bet you can't eat just one. And with my template of the syllogistic method that I use to construct every single body paragraph across the expository modes, uh, a lot of action happens within that body paragraph. You can't do things on a singular basis. And that's often what students, they come to me with. They do one paragraph tone, one paragraph syntax, one paragraph diction. And it's like, no. You need to begin to see, especially at the AP level, how the pieces intersect and interface with each other, how they jigsaw piece together. And what we'll do using some glue and some potato chips is illustrate how we can make this an edible template, an edible graphic organizer. So the requisite supplies, I went out and bought these snack packs of Lay's potato chips. So Fritos, sour cream and onion, barbecue Cheetos, plain Fritos, Doritos, Funyuns, and just put them out on my table and had students come to the center table at certain points in the construction of their essay. And then they're going to be gluing some of these chips down to their essay. Sounds weird, but you're going to see that it's actually kind of an ingenious concept. So here's the deal. The syllogistic method happens in sequences of 2s and 3s when you transition from the introductory paragraph. When you get into the body paragraphs, it's always first premise, second premise, conclusion. So you got 3s. And in the first premise for literary analysis and for rhetorical analysis, again, you typically have a sequence of 3s. What happens with students when they write is they break that sequence. And what we call it as composition teachers is this: breaking the line of reasoning. So the line of reasoning snaps. If they can keep this chain going, they will have a very cogent line of reasoning. But it's all upon that adage of bet you can't eat just one. Right? If you do it in the thesis, you got to do it in the first premise, you got to do it in the second premise, you got to do it in the conclusion, right? And I'll model that for you a few times. So for those that are new with my work, let me go over the syllogistic method real quick. Basically, it's an Aristotelian concept. When Aristotle was a teacher at his school called the Lyceum, he taught the rich aristocratic boys oration, polemics, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would often throw out these big, juicy, essential questions like, what is justice? And these great philosophical think tankers, these great scholars would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle, like, many of us composition instructors, said, did God come around on his gravy train and endow some students with the gift of the gab and some with just like kind of, sort of, and some they're just going to tank bomb all their debates and be terrible orators? And we say the same of our writers. And he said, no, I can't be defeatist. I have to teach. I have to make sure that even my kids that are struggling, the ones that are really emerging, the burgeoning ones, catapult forward and absolutely flourish as thinkers and speakers. Same goes for our writers. And one day he had a eureka moment. He said, I got it. The really good orators think syllogistically. And what he meant by that is this. They argue premise, conclusion, very mathematic, very computative. He used the word cogent. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. We all would naturally conclude that my dog's going to die, right? That's just logic. It's logic, deductive, inductive reasoning. Right? It's logic. When students write, we want them to be that computative and that bulletproof in the articulation of their reasoned argument. Now, in terms of performing literary analysis, there are certain things that students can do to wield the punches of that syllogistic construct. So to define the terms, to define the parts, the first premise is an argument anchored in literary terms, devices, and techniques. The second premise is textual support. So you teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. And the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, so again, the conclusion of the body paragraph, not the conclusion of the essay, is where the textual analysis is housed. And this is where you throw your links back to the prompt, you echo the thesis, and you kind of shake hands back with that first premise, because the first premise is a promise. All of this takes about 10 to 12 sentences. So a prototypical syllogistic body paragraph across the expository modes with my template is going to be about 10 to 12 sentences long. So those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers don't seem to work. So I'll model this for you a few times. And the poem I'm going to use first, given that we're using food, is Mountain Dew Commercial Disguised as a Love Poem by Matthew Olzmann. And what I'll do is show you the exercise, the writing workshop, as I would run it in my class using student samples. So here's the thing. You got to keep the promise of the first premise. And so what my students did was I had them take 3 sentences to write the first premise. Always 3 sentences, again, always across the expository mode to keep the centrality of the argument. So on FRQ 1 of the AP Lang exam, the College Board says, your argument must be central. And even though we're doing literary analysis, the centrality of the argument must be kept. So when you're keeping the promise of the first premise, I tell my students this: multitask, eat from a couple bags of chips, but don't stop at one. Bet you can't eat just one. So dabble from a couple bags of chips, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Oftentimes when students write, when they're performing literary analysis, and I alluded to this earlier, they go 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph conflict, 1 paragraph theme, 1 paragraph extended metaphor, whatever. They don't multitask, and it's a very unsophisticated way to analyze. So what I have my students do is this. We analyzed that Mountain Dew poem together as a class, and we tore it apart and analyzed everything during our Socratic seminar. So we demystified it, right? There was no guessing how to analyze it. What we had to figure out was how to write it, how to write the essay. So students ask good questions, and they often ask, where do I begin my essay? So I say, start where Olzmann starts, start where the author starts. So my students begin their essays, their body paragraphs, with little clauses like this, right from the onset. It cues the reader into knowing that you have a chronology and a sequence, that you're going to be very methodic, chronological, like deliberate and computative in your execution of your analysis. So as to break that do one thing at a time rhythm, my students just pick a couple terms, devices, techniques that construct meaning in the piece. So I'll give you an example of this. Again, the first premise is always going to be 3 sentences long. Right from the onset, Olzmann indicates that he's going to enumerate his logic very painstakingly through a syntactical manipulation. What follows the colon is a long list of reasons as to why the marriage will survive. Interesting enough, each reason is offset by a subordinate conjunction. So in the first premise, I want to hear the terms, devices, techniques. And what I have my students do is this. Typically, they're gonna lay down like 2 to 3 terms. I don't want it to be a literary terms dumping ground. So 2 or 3 of the like salient things that happen early in the poem. And then what they do is glue down a different chip next to the term. So here I have just a classic bag of chips, and that's going to be indicative of the enumeration, right? So Olzmann uses enumeration, and it establishes his logic. Even though we're doing literary analysis, this poem is very logos driven. So the enumeration is going to be designated by this yellow bag of chips. The blue bag of chips is going to be tied to the syntax. And then the red bag of chips is really going to focus on the subordinating conjunction. So we got yellow, blue, red. Now, you can't stop at just eating one, right? So here's what we're going to need. We're going to need a quote or a paraphrase, or both, for the yellow bag, quote, paraphrase for the blue bag, quote, paraphrase for the red bag. If we are to sustain our line of reasoning, all we need in this body paragraph is yellow chips, blue chips, red chips. Since we went yellow first, it's probably a good idea in the fourth sentence where we start the second premise to go yellow, but you don't have to. You don't have to be that methodic and organized. You can bounce around a little bit, but you need support and analysis for yellow, support analysis for blue, support analysis for red. Let's see where this author goes. So second premise begins, fourth sentence. So begin to quote and paraphrase. Immediately, almost playfully ponderous, he suggests that here's what he's got, the reasons why their marriage might work, colon. From a syntactical perspective, a policing grammarian would most likely advise any writer not to follow a colon with a long string of subordinating clauses, all beginning with the word because. Well, why are we doing that? And why did I drop those bags of chips there? Because you promised it. The first premise is a promise, and you can't stop at just one. So you got to get into the syntax because you promised that. You got to talk about the enumeration. You got to talk about the logic. All this stuff must be talked about in the second premise. So let's go on. This error, if you will, is fitting in light of the reasons Olzmann delineates. Virtually every detail described to the wife is extraordinarily commonplace but idiosyncratic, just as the syntax is. Do you see this? So you can't stop at just one. You promised your reader that you'd cough up some chips, right? You can't stop at just one. We need support and an analysis for this. You have to show the syntax because you promised it. The love between husband and wife will endure because the small private things such as laughing loudly at your own jokes and because she yells at her keys when she loses them is what makes the wife so uniquely worthy of his everlasting love. Love, typically, is expressed in feminine language, but the husband loves that she writes poems about bullets and gravestones and that she can hold a pistol, gut a pig, right? So you need lots of support. You need lots of analysis. But note here, these quote transitions are silky smooth. There's a template within the template. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words, so a minimum, not exactly, a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, but you also have to bracket from time to time. And I did a lot of bracketing in this, right? It should sound conversational, but you can see here, go back. You can't stop at just one. So I have quotes and paraphrase for the red bag, quotes paraphrase for the blue bag, quotes paraphrases for the yellow bag. And it doesn't necessarily matter how you arrange it. So keep going here. There's a mundane nature to true love, and one can find it in those who circle the things they think are important and put stars next to the things they think their lover should think is important. Ordinary acts, such as merely annotating a text, hold space for love. It's in the doing, giving, and being of a couple that denies the self to be consumed in flames. So now we got to wrap this up, right? So that's second premise. Second premise is a big part here. That's going to comprise most of your 10 to 12 sentences. The conclusion of the body paragraph, again, this is not a conclusion of the essay, it's the conclusion of the body paragraph, echoes the thesis, echoes the prompt, shake hands with the first premise. Takes a couple of sentences, and you still got to be talking about those chips. Love will endure forever and for always if one can stay off the proverbial shit list as Olzmann does and take pleasure in simple joys like pork recipes and extended favors done out of the pureness of heart. Love will also endure forever if one places their partner first and remembers that even small acts reverberate on a large scale. So let me explain how I did a writing workshop for this. As students write, I have them in a think pair square, so desk arranged in fours, so 4 people working together. One essay is being analyzed at a time, and I just have my guys email each other or put them in Google Classroom so that they can view them on their Chromebooks. The group, right, the peers need to identify the promise and put the chips next to the terms that are being dropped. It's a great way to ensure that your students are multitasking to break that singular rhythm of one paragraph, diction, tone, syntax, etc. Make sure they're multitasking and having the terms, devices, and techniques talk to each other, hold hands with each other, interface with each other. If you drop it in the first premise, you gotta eat more than one, right? So my guys are just sitting there at their table, they're eating chips and they're proofreading, they're editing, making sure that the line of reasoning staying intact. But they also make sure that above and beyond yellow, blue, and red, you don't want green chips, you don't want purple chips, you don't want, some funky colored chip coming in here to waylay the line of reasoning. All you have is red, blue, and orange. That's it. That's it. That's it. Nothing else can come into the picture here. So all the quotes and paraphrases were germane to the chips that we put here. And I literally have my kids glue chips down to their essays that they print to make sure that the line of reasoning is intact. And then I look at them and I make sure that likewise their line of reasoning staying intact. And it is a great alternative grading method because half of the essay is already graded. They know whether or not they sustained their line of reasoning, and that's half the battle. So want to see me do it again? I will show my AP friends, and even if you don't teach AP, this is a good one to see. The 2022 FRQ one poem, Richard Blanco, Shaving. And it's a great poem, and it gave some kids some fits. It's rich, it's dense, there's a lot going on in it, but you can write it the exact same way we just did the Mountain Dew poem. So note, student starts right from the onset. Show that you got chronology, show that you got sequence. Right from the onset, Blanco manipulates his syntax to highlight his theme. So syntax is that bag of chips, theme is blue bag of chips. In stacking similes, so similes is red bag of chips. He also reinforces the idea that life's big mystery is quite simple to understand. Everything is connected to the laws of nature and the natural order of things. Even his reflections upon his father's life while shaving belong to this connection. So there's going to be a big conversation in the second premise about theme. There's going to be quite a bit of conversation about the similes and syntax. So we have orange, blue, red. We made you a promise in these 3 sentences. We got to talk about syntactical features, we got to hunker in on theme, and then we got to analyze a few similes. So look how this goes. 4th sentence, begin quoting, begin paraphrasing. Immediately, Blanco conjoins the first 2 clauses with a comma splice. Well, we're talking about comma splices. Why? And I have that bag of chips there because it's attached to the syntax. You can't eat just one. In order to sustain the line of reasoning, you have to drop some quotes and paraphrases to show that. So let's keep going here. He informs us that he's not shaving, he's writing about it. The comma splice is an interesting feature because it cues the reader to the idea that Blanco is likewise going to connect everything to highlight the gist of his theme. Blue chip is theme. The hyphen gives way to a long series of similes that show how even something as mundane as shaving and writing are like ocean steam rising from clouds and ultimately the same silent forces that quietly orchestrated his father's life and passing. So as we're talking about the similes here, we're also getting into the theme, but we're also focusing on the hyphen, which is syntax. So you can't eat just one. They all have to interface. They all have to hold hands and jigsaw connect with each other. So it continues. Let's go on. Blanco, with a contemplative and musing tone, is beginning to see that the discrete mystery of how whiskers grow is really the same thread to explain the drink roses take from the vase. Things in life just happen like the bloom of spider webs each morning, but all too often was to not pause long enough to take notice of how everything in life is like one gigantic jigsaw piece. All right, so we were talking about the things that we have quotes and paraphrases about the things we were talking about way back here. Syntax, theme, similes. Syntax, theme, similes. Syntax, theme, similes. All the quotes and paraphrases need to be pertinent, relevant, germane to what you dropped in that first line. So if you drop it in the first premise, you need support, you need analysis. You got to drop it more than once. You can't stop at just one. You need to eat more than one chips. They're so compelling. You need more than one chip. In the conclusion, hook it back to the thesis statement, the prompt, keep the promise of the first premise. In acknowledging his own mortality, Blanco is beginning to see that these simple acts like shaving and writing likewise mark the days of his father's life. There is an intensity to vanishing, but knowing that life is fleeting and impermanent is comforting, given that everything belongs to a divine order. And that, my friends, is how to make an edible template, an edible graphic organizer. So I don't know if you want your kids eating paper and glue, but I let them munch at the chips at will as they were writing. It's kind of like will work for food. I notice when I put food out in front of kids and markers and glue and colored pencils and glitter, they tend to work better. It's really weird. Return them to kind of elementary level fun, and engagement goes way up. So I like this exercise. So I'll do it for the other FRQs for the AP Lit exam. I'm also going to make a follow-up video for rhetorical analysis, because my template of the syllogistic method, it works every single time kids do rhetorical analysis, literary analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, and even research. It's all following that line of reasoning, and then you just sprinkle in the stuff that I do with my Nuance Academy and Word Study Academy, and voila, you got yourself some killer writers. So if you got questions or want to try your hand at this, feel free to give me a shout at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. If you would like these slides, you can also email me. Also note that I'm doing a ton of work with the National Writing Project going forward. So on a monthly basis, we have a cadence where we're doing these one-off 2-hour intensives, but I'm also running my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind through them, and as well as offering a self-paced course. So if you want to take a look at those one-offs or the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind or even the self-paced course, my website has all of that information, teachinghowtowrite.com. So teachinghowtowrite.com. So hopefully you found this to be fun and edible, and happy teaching, happy writing.